Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. We're going to get started now. I am Patricia Manti with USAID's Water Office, and thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar hosted by the Sustainable Wash Systems Learning Partnership, also known as SWS. This presentation will include an introduction about network analysis, and you'll also hear about some early lessons learned from network analyses conducted in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Cambodia. SWS partners include IRC, Link, Tetra Tech, Watershed, Wave Solutions, the University of Colorado Boulder, University of Oxford, Environmental Incentives, and USAID. SWS is working to identify solutions to the challenge of developing robust local systems to sustain wash service delivery. The partnership is using network analysis to better understand the complex interactions and interdependencies among actors in a local wash system. Today's presenters are Matt Gutentag with Link, Yanita Bartel, who is with Watershed, Lucia Henry with Tetra Tech, and Angela Houston with IRC. And our moderator today is Liz Jordan, a Water and Sanitation Advisor in USAID's Water Office. Before we get started, just a few things you should know about the webinar platform. Please note the location of the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and that's what you're going to use to submit any questions or comments, so not the chat box. And if you have any technical issues, Grace and Dan on our webinar technical team will do their best to help you, and they'll monitor the Q&A box for these issues. You can submit a question at any time during the presentation, but the questions will be answered after we've heard from all of our speakers. I also need to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared later this week. You can get the slides from today's presentation under the handout setting on the upper right. And all of these resources will be available on USAID's Water Sector Knowledge Hub, globalwaters.org. And I will now turn things over to Liz.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing the slides on my window. I'm Liz Jordan from USAID's Water Office, and I'm going to speak a little bit about SWS as a wider initiative and what we are going to be doing throughout this wider partnership. I do want to begin by giving an acknowledgement to the wider group, and just to note that this is a very broad partnership. There's a lot of people involved. You'll only hear from a few today, representing a few different organizations. And this includes some key people at USAID, my colleague Ella Lazarte, and also the University of Colorado team leading this, Eddie Perez, Dan Hollander, Carl Linden, and Amy Javernick-Will, along with a wide group of people from all of the partners that Patricia mentioned. So the first question is, why are we focusing on sustainability? Why is that important? USAID's goal under our Water and Development Plan in support of the Global Water Strategy is to increase the availability and sustainable management of safe water and sanitation for the underserved and most vulnerable. It's really critical here that we're focusing on sustainability. Despite billions of dollars of investment over decades, failure rates are continuing to be very high. We know that there's some data around rural water points in sub-Saharan Africa with failure rates in the range of 30 or 40%. And we know that just building infrastructure, putting in new hardware is not going to equal access to sustainable services. So it's really critical here that we think about how we can ensure that host country partners and local actors are taking ownership of the systems that we put in place, and that those local systems, the local networks of actors are in place to deliver inputs and resources, that they're able to maintain results and deliver impacts beyond the life of the project. So why are we taking a systems approach to doing this? Well, if we want the local system to be able to, take ownership of the pumps and pipes and hardware, if we want them to be able to perform the operations and maintenance and have the financing and governance arrangements in place to sustain those development outcomes, we need to work on strengthening that local system. And what's really key here is USAID's local systems framework, which notes that that's going to depend on the contributions of multiple interconnected actors. There's not any one person that you could just train well enough and have your system be sustainable. It's a broad group of actors. So what SWS is defining as a systems approach is an approach that seeks to understand the complexity, interactions, and interdependencies between actors involved in the system and the factors that will influence the sustainability. And we're doing that in a deliberate, rigorous manner, some of which you'll see today around building that understanding. We're then going to act on the new understanding, both through our partners under SWS and also by facilitating local actors to take action. And regularly adapt to feedback and changing conditions, knowing that this isn't a linear process. It's not always predictable to know what will happen in the local system. And so we need to be adaptive throughout our process. So what exactly are we doing? Well, we're testing 4 promising concepts. We're looking at collective action for rural sanitation and hygiene services in Cambodia, a similar approach at the district level through learning alliances for rural water and small town sanitation in Ethiopia and Uganda. We're looking at preventative maintenance approaches for rural water points in Uganda, and similarly, maintenance models for small pipe systems in a county in Kenya. By and large, this is a learning activity. It's a learning partnership. So these are 4 concepts that are very promising, but the goal here is not just to implement, but to learn as we go. And we hope that by learning about these promising approaches that are systems-based, we can better understand when, where, and how these can be applied in current or future programs, both for USAID and for the wider water sector. So what is our approach? This is a very simplified version. There's a lot more information about the SWS process. What we're first doing is working to understand the network of actors and factors that influence the system. That understanding, some of which you'll see today, is really at the foundation of what we're doing. The actor networks is what we're talking about here today. Through the organizational network analysis, we'll better understand the roles and relationships of the different organizations that are working locally. The next step then is to intervene. Sorry, slides seem to be skipping ahead without me. Once we have that understanding of the system, all of these activities are working with the system actors to help set the priorities and better understand what should be done. What kind of activities might best strengthen the system? So they might address issues around the roles and relationships in the actor networks, or they might address specific factors. We then want to intervene both via our own partners and through facilitating others to intervene to strengthen that network of actors and factors. On this slide here, you can see some examples. Those interventions might address issues of financing, issues of marketing, issues of asset management. There's a wide array. We're not coming in with a predetermined list of interventions that are going to be implemented. The point is really here to use the understanding of the network and the knowledge of the local stakeholders to design the interventions. And the goal of this is to achieve a more sustainable water and sanitation service. We aren't going to be able to see that within 5 years. Sustainability takes a really long time to measure. But what we're going to do is look for proxy indicators that let us know that we're improving the likelihood that services are going to be sustained as a result of these activities. And finally, and really critically, what we want to do is make sure we're adapting to changing circumstances, that we're continuing to map the system, that we're continuing to look at what effect our interventions are having on the actors and factors in the system, and change our approaches when needed. And that's really a critical component of this activity. So with that, it's time, I think, to hear some of the practical examples of what we're doing to gain that understanding. And we'll begin with a bit of an overview of organizational network analysis, which Matt Gutentag from Link will present for us.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the key concepts in network analysis as a background for my colleagues to describe how it's been applied in a couple of the SWS settings. So what is network analysis? So at its most fundamental level, network analysis is a way of examining relationships among actors. And organizational network analysis looks specifically at relationships among organizations. And we're using the term relationship here broadly. This can really be any connection between two organizations at all. And we think network analysis fits well into the systems toolbox because looking at actors is a key part of a systems approach. And it gives us a tool to model the complexity of how these different organizations interact on different dimensions. Now, when we talk about network analysis throughout this presentation, we're going to be using diagrams and models that look at what are called nodes. So those are the actors, or in this case, organizations, represented by dots in the diagrams, and edges. So those are connections between two organizations in the network, represented by lines connecting two dots. And this lets us examine both the structure of the network as a whole. So in other words, what we can say about the relationship among all the group members together. Are these relationships centralized, diffuse, are there clusters, etc., as well as the comparative structure of relationships of individual organizations. So is a given organization highly central in the network? Does it serve as a bridge between other organizations, and so on? So how are we using this sort of analysis in SWS? So one nice thing about network analysis is that it can be used for multiple purposes, which we're really taking advantage of fully. So first of all, we're using it as part of our intervention design. So within SWS, there are a number of different coalition models being developed and tested. So in Ethiopia alone, for example, we're setting up 4 different coalitions on the ground, groups of actors that are working together and collaborating in different locales. And of course, each of these coalitions is being set up within the context of existing local relationships and organizational dynamics of their local system. So by using network analysis, we're able to help our SWS partners to understand the current relationships that exist among these coalition members or potential coalition members if they're just being set up, and think through the implications that this relationship structure might have on how the coalitions should be designed and managed. So in addition, network analysis is part of our monitoring and evaluation approach. We're conducting the network analyses iteratively, in some cases annually, in some cases at a baseline and end line, and this lets us track how the overall structure of relationships and specific actors' relationships change over time throughout the life of the project. So by combining that with qualitative insights, we can get a sense of the contribution that these coalitions have made to the shifts in relationship structures on the ground, which when combined with our other analyses can give us a better sense of how the intervention is affecting sustainability. And finally, we're particularly excited about the fact that in a number of the SWS activities, we're using the network analysis as a facilitation tool as well. So what this means is that we're working with the coalition facilitators to integrate some of the results and the sorts of diagrams that you're going to be seeing into the group discussions with the coalition members. And so we found this can be a really useful basis for group discussions on, for example, how the participation might be structured, or what sorts of specific activities the consortium might want to focus on, since we're taking a very participatory approach to developing answers to those questions. So what specifically can network analysis help you understand? I'm going to quickly touch on a couple of the specific metrics and analyses that we use in network analysis. There are many of these, but I'm going to bring up a couple and describe a couple that we're using in this activity specifically. So one thing you might want to understand is the overall nature of the network. So for that, we might look at a few metrics such as density, which is simply how connections exist among the organizations in the network relative to how many possible connections there could be. So you end up with a really simple proportion, and it gives you a starting point for talking about how the network is structured. You might also want to look at distance, which is the sort of degrees of separation idea. So if you know the game 6 Degrees of Separation from Kevin Bacon, looking at the relationships between actors in movies, it's like that. How many organizations or actors in the network would you have to go through to get to another organization? So you might look at the average number of steps across the network, the average distance, or you might look at the longest distance between any two organizations in the network. And as you can see, there are different metrics that can be used to give you different perspectives on the same objective, on the structure of the network. And that really speaks to the fact that there's no one ideal network, so there's no one number that can tell you everything. And all of these give you different perspectives that in the whole give you a really good view of what's going on in the network. So another exercise that can be quite useful is around what's called community detection. So trying to identify the subgroups within the network that have lots of connections among themselves. So there are lots of different approaches to doing this. Again, some of them, for example, look for different clusters. So that's trying to find really tightly connected groups of actors throughout the network. But others might be trying to identify a core group in the network. So a structure that's more a core periphery. You have one set of actors that have a tight group of connections and then other actors around the outside that aren't connected to each other or to that group at all. And finally, you can use network analysis to look at specific organizations to measure which ones are the most influential according to different measures. So what's nice is that, like the metrics around the overall structure, the network analysis metrics around influence are also understood to be multidimensional. So some metrics like degree centrality look at which actors have the most connections. It's just a normalized measure of how many connections a given organization has. But you also have metrics such as betweenness centrality, which looks at to what extent a given organization is important in serving as a bridge between other organizations, or a bottleneck, depending on the nature of the network. So that was just a few examples to give you a sense of what network analysis is, how we're using it, and then some of the specific metrics we use. So now I'll turn it over to my colleagues to describe how we've applied that in the different SWS settings.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction, Matt. We're going to turn now to some practical examples of how this worked amongst the partners, and we'll begin with a presentation from Janita from Watershed, who's going to talk a bit about the network analysis they did to look at the rural sanitation and hygiene sector in Cambodia.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you to the USAID Global Water team for organizing this webinar and giving us the opportunity to share our experience with organizational network analysis. And thank you for the audience for taking the time to tune in and learn about ONA. My name is Janita. I manage research and learning at Watershed. Watershed is a local NGO based in Cambodia that focuses on building sustainable market systems for wash products and services in rural areas. To give some context, Cambodia has seen big improvements in the wash situation over the last 8 to 10 years. But Cambodia has also been a poster child of a projectivized approach to development. That means that individual organizations drive problem analysis, they lead implementation, and they're held accountable only to the international donors. Although there's some initial coordination mechanisms at national and subnational level, this projectivized approach means that we make slow progress towards targets because we duplicate efforts, because there's weak coordination, and because there are competing approaches. And in many cases, that means that we jeopardize the sustainability of outcomes beyond the life of a project. So the challenge of the sector facing that the sector is facing in the coming years will be to accelerate the progress and sustain the improvements, and to reach the really hard to reach households in order to realize the country's vision of being 100% ODF in 2025. Now, under SWS, how are we going to support the sector in doing that? As part of the SWS consortium, we propose to focus on the how and not so much on the what. That is, as this concept focuses on how we coordinate and communicate with each other, how we share knowledge, and how we work together across different groups of stakeholders, rather than jumping straight to the discussion which intervention is the most effective to address existing gaps. So for this work, relationships between organizations and individuals are foundational. They are the building blocks of the system, but often we see that they're overlooked both for measurements and for implementation.
It seems like we may have lost Janita. Give her a few seconds here. Janita, we can't hear you if you are still on.
Hear me back? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Oh, great. Yes, you're back. Thank you.
Yeah. Where did you lose me?
I think you were just beginning to talk about this slide and the overall network.
Okay. So then I'll rewind to the beginning of that slide. So for this work, the focusing on the how and not so much on the what, the relationships between organizations and individuals are foundational. They're the building blocks of any system. But far too often we see in the space that we work that they're overlooked both for measurement and for implementation. So we used O&A to explore existing relationships between organizations that work in rural sanitation and hygiene at national level in Cambodia. For this purpose, we interviewed 89 organizations that have a presence in Phnom Penh and goals related to rural sanitation and hygiene, or a minimum of resources allocated to addressing rural sanitation and hygiene issues. And we asked them a bunch of questions: who they share information with, how confident they are in their partners being open for discussion, reliable, and fair, and a series of questions about their own organizations. For example, what they focus their work on, where they operate, what approach they take, and what size their budget has. So this picture here shows what the whole network looks like. The different colors of the dots stand for different types of organizations. The size of the bubble represents the number of contacts that these organizations have. Each arrow between the dots represents a relationship between organizations. That means that one organization reports that it shares information with another organization, and the arrow is pointing in the direction in which the information is shared. So you can see maybe there's a tiny little arrowhead on each of these lines. Now, when we show this picture to people, the spontaneous reaction is, "Oh wow, that looks cool." And then there's a little awkward pause, and then people ask, "So what exactly does this tell me about relationships?" So I want to take you, as part of this presentation, a little bit deeper into the numbers of this network. This table summarizes the density of relationships between different types of organizations. The way to read this table is as follows. The 34 INGOs that we interviewed named 48 relationships with LNGOs, and those 48 relationships are equivalent to 7% of all possible relationships to LNGOs that INGOs could have named. So that's network density, as Matt has mentioned in the previous presentation. So as a reminder, the relationship consists of sharing information from one organization to the other. Now at first sight, this is probably just as big as a mess as the previous graph. But let me point out some interesting cells in this table to you. First, look at these two pairs. They highlight the relationships with INGOs and government named by development partners, and vice versa. So INGOs named in total 52 relationships with development partners, but the other way around, development partners only named 23 relationships with INGOs. That means the network density from INGOs to DP is about twice as high as the other way around. And the same pattern we see between DPs and government ministries. Government names 20 relationships with DPs, but DPs name only 10 relationships with government. If you compare the average number of contacts or ties per actor by type of organization, we see that development partners have on average 11.3 contacts per organizations that share information with them, but only 5.1 contacts per organization that they share information with. So a similar asymmetry as in DPs we see in government here in the number of ties. So a key takeaway from this table for us is that there are asymmetries in information sharing within the network, and this means that it might prevent certain types of organizations to reach their full potential in contributing to the network, in receiving information that exists within the network, and eventually to effectively coordinate. I admit there are lots of numbers in this table, so I'm happy to answer any questions later on if there should be any. But also the complexity of the table illustrates the complexity of data in general that we use working with a system of that size. So when digging a little bit further in the data together with our partners Link, we noticed two dividing lines cutting through the sector: language and gender. We took the language, English or Khmer, in which the interview was conducted, as a proxy for the language spoken at management level within the organizations. So if we then look at the connectivity, and this table summarizes that, between English and Khmer-speaking organizations respectively, as well as the connectivity between these groups of organizations, we see that English-speaking organizations are much better connected among each other than Khmer-speaking organizations are. Then a similar pattern we see when we look at gender. This time we directly ask for the gender of the head of the organization or of the department for government departments. A similar pattern to that of language emerged. Male-headed organizations connect much more frequently among each other than female-headed organizations do. Now, there are many more findings from the ONA that I could show you. One example could be the clusters and subgroups within this network, but I won't have time as part of this webinar to go through all of it. I would encourage you to go to the handout section on the right-hand side of your screen and read through the ONA research brief from Cambodia and follow up with us in person if you like. So to wrap up this presentation, there are three key takeaways from this ONA process in Cambodia. The first one is that the process of conducting the ONA and involving stakeholders is just as important as the findings themselves. So especially for smaller organizations, they said that ONA interview was the first time that they were given a voice, that someone asked them for their opinion, and that they were taken seriously. This is something that is not to be underestimated in this process of trying to encourage organizations to coordinate with each other a little bit better. Second, we made the experience that in this process, we didn't necessarily uncover scandalous new truths. Rather, it made certain things measurable that some people in the sector already suspected that they were there, but never really had a proof. Like the gender divide, or like the asymmetries in communication. Making these issues visible does not sit comfortably with everyone. Because in the end, seeing these stark dividing lines, for example, in gender or language, is a strong call for action that we can't shy away from anymore. And the third takeaway that I want to share with you is that the ONA draws attention to relationships within the sector. For some in the audience, this might be a bit of a fluffy takeaway, but through the ONA, we were able to start a discussion within the sector about relationships and how we want to cooperate, how we want to communicate, what resources it takes to make this communication happen, and what are some of the barriers that we need to overcome. Because in the end, it's relationships that make the difference between a group of organizations trying their very best to improve the water situation in Cambodia and a system of organization that works together towards a common goal. Now, I'll stop here and I'll hand it back over to Liz. And of course, I welcome questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janita. That was very interesting, and I know people are probably already thinking about questions for the end. We'll turn it over now, though, to Lucia from Tetra Tech, who's going to talk a bit about a network analysis that was done in Ethiopia focused on small town sanitation.
Thanks, Liz. I'm Lucia Henry, and I work for Tetra Tech. Tetra Tech leads the small town sanitation work within SWS. We work in a town called Waliso, which is about 2.5 hours southwest of Addis. This morning, I will be sharing a few findings from the ONA conducted in this town, and I'll start with a brief background on Waliso. The town's official population is about 61,000, but unofficially, the population could be as high as 100,000. There is no centralized sewer network in the town, and all sanitation facilities are on site. There are institutional arrangements for wash in place, and sanitation efforts are led by the Municipal Department of Sanitation Beautification. There is also a water utility which operates a vacuum truck for emptying services. However, water is prioritized over sanitation, and most efforts for sanitation have focused on containment. There is limited collection and emptying, and there is currently no treatment, although there was a rudimentary disposal site which was closed due to complaints of smells from nearby residents. An increasing number of communal and public toilets are becoming non-functional, and this is partially as a result of the closure of the disposal site as toilet blocks are filling up and can't be emptied. And it's also partially as a result of poor management. The women's associations are responsible for the day-to-day operations and cleaning, but there is no one or no entity that has been identified as responsible for the long-term maintenance of these facilities. It is also important to note that shared facilities provide a vital service to many households and account for 31% of facilities at national level, and our household survey revealed that 13% of households rely on shared facilities in Waliso. There is also a high percentage of traditional pits which are unlined, and this allows the contents to infiltrate the surrounding environment. And this obviously poses a higher health risk as the town continues to urbanize and relies on increasing groundwater sources for drinking water. Tetra Tech's ultimate goal is to improve the quality and sustainability of sanitation services, specifically fecal sludge management in the urban context, by strengthening local systems responsible for these services. We will strengthen the local systems using a Learning Alliance approach, which is a formalized platform for local stakeholders who are working in the urban sanitation space in Waliso. As our approach is to strengthen these local systems, we first needed to understand what was in place. And to achieve this, our local partner Link conducted an organizational network analysis, which included a survey of the relationships among the network of local stakeholders in Waliso. After conducting the initial analysis, Link worked with Tetra Tech's local facilitator to identify a few key findings that would be most useful to share back to the local stakeholders to help frame and guide the initial kickoff Learning Alliance discussions. We are now using the ONA to design the Learning Alliance structure and activities, and Link will be conducting a follow-on survey each year to track the change in network structure and relationships over the life of the project. I'll highlight 3 key findings from the ONA. This diagram depicts how information is shared among local organizations in Waliso. And the analysis revealed a strong core periphery structure in the network. A core or central group, which is circled here, of about half of the local organizations reporting numerous connections amongst themselves, and the other half of the organizations having fewer connections with each other and with that core group. This is not really surprising, as the structure reflects the hierarchy in the town, and organizations that have a mandate for sanitation make up the core group. For example, the Municipal Department of Sanitation and Beautification, which leads sanitation efforts in the town, the utility, which provides emptying services, and
Sorry, it seems like we've got a bit of connection problem with Lucia. You're cutting in and out a bit.
I think am I back on right now?
Yes, you are. Thanks.
Perfect, perfect. Where did you lose me?
I think you were describing the core periphery structure and just talking a bit about who were in the outlying positions.
Okay. So we used these findings, we presented them back to the local stakeholders, and used them as a basis for a discussion on how the Learning Alliance could be structured to firstly facilitate communication and integrate organizations at the periphery, and secondly, provide a platform that ensures that periphery organizations inform decision-making. The local stakeholders then decided that the Learning Alliance can build on this core group of stakeholders by having a tiered structure. That is a core group of decision makers that can drive political will and implementation of interventions carried out by the wider group. As with the previous slide, this diagram depicts information sharing amongst the local stakeholders, and we've highlighted the key members at our periphery or have seemingly less connections or less integrated within the network. It became clear that despite their important day-to-day work on sanitation issues, some key organizations do not seem to be heavily linked into information sharing or coordination within the local stakeholder network. And in this instance, we highlight the Women's Association. The women's associations exist in all neighborhoods, and the members are typically residents of these neighborhoods themselves. They are responsible for the management of communal latrines, which are handed over to them once construction is completed. This particular finding was used to raise the profile of periphery organizations and discuss which ones could better be engaged through the Learning Alliance in order to facilitate communication and integrate these organizations. So as the Learning Alliance strategy is developed, particular attention will be placed on integrating organizations such as the women's associations into the process. Whereas the previous figures depicted information sharing amongst stakeholders, this figure depicts coordination amongst the stakeholders. And it became clear that direct coordination of sanitation activities among local stakeholders tends to be highly clustered. And we tried to highlight these groups here. Only a few organizations, such as the manager of municipal services, is coordinating with a range of stakeholders around sanitation activities. For example, from this figure, we can see that the health office has no direct connections with the Department of Sanitation and Beautification or with the utility. Instead, its link to them is through the manager of municipal services. We will track the structure of coordination amongst the stakeholders over time as the Learning Alliance activities are undertaken to understand the ways in which the Learning Alliance contributes to how coordination happens in Waliso. And going forward, the next iterations of the ONA, we will pay particular attention to the changes in the coordination relationships, including more of a focus on measuring the quality of these relationships. And with that, I will then hand back over to Liz. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. So our final presentation on the country examples is going to be on network analysis within Kabarole district in Uganda. And this work is going to be presented by Angela Houston of IRC, but I do want to acknowledge that the work was done and the report drafted by Duncan McNichol. Unfortunately, he is in Uganda and has limited connectivity, but he is on the line and will hopefully be able to answer some questions if anyone has any deeper dive questions on this topic that Angela can relay to him. So with that, I'll hand it over to Angela.
Thank you very much, Liz. So yes, thank you to Duncan for this work. He also worked closely with Peter Magara and Martin Watsizi, my IRC Uganda colleagues, on the data collection and study and interpretation of data for this work. I'm Angela Houston. I am working on monitoring and learning through the SWS program, supporting both Ethiopia and Uganda through IRC. So this work brings us to Kabarole in Western Uganda, working on rural water. So just to give you a bit of background on the context, 21% of the population lack access to water, and 60% of the population, in fact, receives substandard levels of service for rural water. So this is accompanied by a low willingness to pay, reasonable considering the substandard level of service provided, but also something that we address in terms of persistent operation and maintenance issues and difficulty in cost recovery at the local level. A recent study IRC worked on with some other partners, including very much budget projections and working with the district government, is that approximately $10 million would be needed to finance the SDG target of universal WASH service coverage. So that's water, sanitation, and hygiene in Kabarole. And the current annual budget for such is $110,000 approximately. So IRC has been working through close partnerships at the district level in Kabarole for over 10 years through a Learning Alliance approach, like what was discussed in previous presentations, that is active at multiple levels. So not only at the regional level, but at the district level, but also at the regional and national level to look for linkages between different administrative responsibilities, funding flows, and other capacity and technical support transfers that occur across those levels. And quite a lot of this work is about testing and improving new models for service delivery or for financing rural WASH services, such as a pay-as-you-fetch model, which we've been working on closely with Water for People, and looking, in addition to cost recovery at the local level, also quite a bit of advocacy work to increase the available finance for rural WASH services. So this network mapping approach was done through a sort of, let's say, a rapid set of interviews that took course over 3 days through an egocentric network mapping exercise. So this is a whole network analysis. So the stakeholders were identified prior to going about the interviews based on our knowledge already of key actors in WASH services there, although some could be added if we'd missed anyone, which were few. And so these included actors at the regional, district, sub-county, and community or parish levels for 2 parishes within 2 different sub-counties in Kabarole. And participants are asked to draw their network. So the pen is handed to the participant to put themselves at the center and then draw out from this predetermined list of stakeholders who are the folks and who are the other stakeholders who they're interacting with regularly. And once they've drawn this out, they answer a few quite open questions about successes, challenges, and solutions to wash sustainability that they're facing, with a focus on rural water. So this next slide here shows a first presentation of one of the key results coming out of this, which looks at betweenness centrality. So this centrality is a measure of how central a stakeholder is in the network, and how likely, essentially, that they are on the shortest distance between two other nodes or two other stakeholders. So this gives us some insight in terms of who might be key points of engagement or key brokers within the system to engage for a change strategy. The larger nodes here, so you can see some clustering in this image that, and it's associated with the colors as well. So you have regional, district, sub-county, and then community or parish level at the bottom of this slide. And the larger nodes here, the larger circles around a specific stakeholder, indicate that they are more central. So one example to point out, there's a lot of lines and a lot of dots. Like Yanita said, it looks cool, but there is quite a bit we can actually get from it. One example here is the large node size of District Councillor Karambi. So we see here that this actor, although there's many different kind of government positions at district level, we found here that the district councillors had quite an important broker role because of their connections to both the district level as well as sub-county and community level. So for implications in terms of our Learning Alliance work, we see that these are core people to engage when we're working on resource transfer or communication that goes across these levels, from district level or even regional level decision-making right to the community level. So this next slide here shows different frequencies of interactions. So from the previous slide, yearly, that's in the upper left, and then we see the ties that exist when we look at connections that occur on a quarterly, monthly, or weekly basis. And so we can see that networks of higher frequency interactions, such as weekly interactions, have far fewer ties. There are far fewer lines connecting these different stakeholders. And in fact, the actors who are central, the stakeholders who are central, changes when we look at a weekly basis. So while many of these, there are many connections that exist at yearly level. In fact, I think it's about 95% of actors had some kind of ties going on at least annually. But at the weekly basis, the district was much less connected, and the centrality of that sub-county level came through much stronger. And so we see that the gaps in ties certainly tells us something, especially seeing the relative isolation of these communities, suggesting that without any access to information or technical support happening on a regular basis, there are going to be some service delivery challenges that occur, since
Angela, I think we lost you for a moment here.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, now you're back. Thanks.
Okay, great. Did you lose me just at the beginning of this slide? Is that correct?
Yes, we lost you just as you switched to this slide.
Okay, great. Thanks for your patience, everyone, with these connectivity challenges. So this is going into the second layer of the analysis that we did. So after people have drawn their network, they're asked to talk about it. Relatively open questions. What's working well? What are challenges? And what are some solutions or possible solutions to the challenges? And so this is important because also just looking at a network and seeing who's connected where doesn't necessarily tell you what's good or bad about it. We have to qualify why things are the way they are and really work with different stakeholders to read and understand what we're seeing, what the data are showing. And so I'll go and present in the next couple of slides a couple of examples of what we get from this factor analysis. So this slide presents an image of all of the different stakeholders who've identified political enforcement of WASH policies as a potential solution. So all stakeholders who mentioned this as a factor, essentially the factors that they've come up with are coded to identify common things and key factors. So those are not from a predetermined list, but those are all the things that come up when different individuals speak. And so what we can see here is that stakeholders at the parish, district, and sub-county level have all identified this as a key issue. So what we can learn here by looking at who are the different actors that identified the same factor, the same issue or success factor, on one hand, it could be evidence that there's some groupthink going on, that these people interact frequently and they're influencing how each other think. But it could also suggest that this is an intervention point, right? So if these individuals aren't all engaged or aren't communicating all of the time, maybe they could be engaged as a sort of task force, or to bring in different perspectives to actually strategically address one of these key issues and brainstorm different ways to go about addressing it or bringing about that success factor. So this next slide talks about the different perceptions of a factor. So we see here on the top of this slide with the orange that a closely related group of stakeholders at district level suggested insufficient or inconsistent resources as a key challenge. Whereas on the bottom half of the slide, you see a lot of communities, a cluster of community stakeholders having the perception that institutional leaders are neglecting their responsibilities. And so while these come out as different factors, it could be, in fact, the same issue or activity, insufficient resources for those institutions to play their roles, which is actually bringing about these different perceptions. And so reading from these data and going back and presenting them and learning a little bit more about what the different experiences are that have led to the data that we're seeing here helps us to understand what are core issues and what are some things that we could address through Learning Alliance work. So lastly, I have just some key conclusions that were coming out of it. What can we learn from network analysis, and essentially how can we bring that to life and take action on it? So network analysis can identify central nodes. So these district counselors, we learned in Cabarole, are most central to the network overall, but other stakeholders in district government are also important to understand. So they could be important to target as a part of a dissemination strategy. They could be important to engage in specific Learning Alliance activities, or also to learn more about how they work and what challenges they face, so they can better play this broker role. Secondly, this analysis is useful in identifying gaps. So while there's a lot of things we can read from the different types of lines and connections that exist, a pure gap in connection does tell us something. And so seeing that many communities are isolated from the broader network, especially at higher frequencies of interactions, suggests that there's a challenge there in terms of getting resources, information, and technical support to that community level where it's needed on a day-to-day basis for service provision. And lastly, this third conclusion, it can be a bit challenging to distill out of it, but is quite likely to provide insight into that our team can take forward. So actors and factor networks can provide insight on how issues are perceived differently by different parts of a network. And so interventions can consider bringing together these stakeholders to collectively identify an issue. So while the core factors that came up during this work may not have been the same ones that we would have suggested, because we take a Learning Alliance approach, stakeholders are collectively agreeing on a set of priorities, and we can learn from this by going back and with stakeholders, what are some ways to take that forward? Who could be engaged or interested to be on a task team to address some of these core issues. So we're really trying not to use this as a one-off analysis for our purpose in terms of learning about the system, but really using it to engage. And lastly, I would just bring out a point that there is this underlying assumption in network theory that actors often in any type of network do not behave strategically because they're only partially aware of their role in the network. And it's difficult to understand connections that aren't directly made to that individual, to oneself. And so we aim to use this tool to give the system and to give the stakeholders that we work with in Cabarole more access to the system itself and to each other, possible ways forward. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Angela, and thanks to all of our presenters, and thanks everyone for the patience with some of our connection issues. This is a big partnership with people all over the world connecting in. So I think it's inevitable to have some of these issues, but I hope that everyone was able to catch all of the core content. And I do want to plug that under the handouts tab in the webinar screen, there are briefs on the Cambodia and Ethiopia analysis, as well as all of the slides. We've left quite a bit of time for some discussion, question and answer from now until 10 o'clock Eastern time. And for those who want to have questions answered, you can type them into the Q&A box. I've been seeing that a couple people have already been through. But I did want to conclude with a couple of remarks just across all of these analyses. I did want to note that, to me, one of the most important things to think about when looking at all of this analysis is there isn't a single ideal network. We're not going to set a target of creating a certain network that has a particular density of connections or that has a specific structure. What works at the national scale in Cambodia, as Janita presented, might be very different from what we want to look at in a small town in Ethiopia. So it's really critical that the analysis is just the first step of a longer process where results are contextualized with stakeholders so that we can determine what's working, what gaps exist, what interventions might support this change, or where we can build upon things that are already working well within the network. For example, as Lucia presented, there might be a core and periphery group structure, as in Waliso. So upon finding that out, we can think about whether we want to strengthen the core and work within that same structure, or bring in the periphery and make them more connected. We can also look at who's central and think about in Cambodia, where the Ministry of Rural Development was the most central actor, how can we use those individuals to be change agents within the network? We should also be thinking about what subgroups exist and why do they exist, and maybe think about how we can increase some of the between-group coordination by identifying a particular person who might connect those disconnected groups. And I also do want to note that this is all under the umbrella of organizational network analysis, but the three examples you've seen today did take different approaches to how they collected the data and how they did the analysis. And this ranged from some longer interviews with a very wide set of stakeholders, where, like in Cambodia, where they cast a very wide net, or a more rapid appraisal of connections that can be done with a pre-selected set of stakeholders at a smaller scale. And there's pros and cons to both of those approaches. It's up to the organization working in this space to determine what's best. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think if anyone has questions on those methods or what people felt like worked and didn't work, our presenters are all here for the Q&A portion. So I'll start out with some of the questions that we've seen come in during the presentation, but please feel free to keep typing questions in. We'll do our best to answer as many as possible in the half hour. So I think the first couple questions I might direct at Matt from Link, who can talk about some of the methodological questions that we're seeing come in. One question came in about the visualizations of the network. So there's particular locations given for each of those nodes, and whether that maps to some sort of geography or how those locations are set up. And then there was another question, I think, about how people were interviewed. So are relationships mapped if only one of the partners reported that they had the relationship, or did both parties need to confirm that they had a relationship? So the example being, you might send people information outwardly, but it doesn't necessarily represent a relationship. So Matt, could you maybe take the first shot at answering those questions?
Sure. So yeah, happy to. Thanks, Liz. On the location question, that's a fairly simple one. So no, those network maps do not correspond to any sort of geographic or topographic location. Those are laid out by software using different algorithms that try to create essentially the most efficient layout based on nodes that have the most relationships with one another laid out more closely together, kind of trying to reduce the amount of overlap of the edges. And there's different methods for that. And you know, in any network analysis paper, you're probably going to see which ones they used for those layouts, but they are not actually meant to correspond to geographies. Certainly, you might see network analyses that have like a map of flight patterns in the US or something, or connections over Facebook, which could be laid out over a map, but we haven't done that here because these weren't, the data we were collecting was not geographically specific in terms of the interactions. In terms of the question on the reporting and are the relationships mapped if only one partner reports? So there are sort of two aspects to that. So one in the information sharing category was in some categories like that you do have directionality of the relationship. So the map actually includes that, maybe it was hard to see, but it includes like arrows that indicate the direction the information was going. So in some relationship types, you're going to have directionality in the sense that information flows in a given direction. In other types of relationships, such as if you're asking about friendships, for example, one would assume that those would be mutual, at least conceptually mutual. But that opens up the second issue in that question, which is more around the validation and interviewing. So even if a relationship is not necessarily directional, if you ask both parties on both ends of it, one might report that it exists and one might not report that it exists. So that's really just a survey issue, and that has to be treated like any other survey design issue where you want to look at, did both parties report it? In our case, when we looked at those relationships, that was actually a part of the analysis, was looking specifically at in what cases the relationship was reported by both parties and in what cases the relationship was just reported by one, because that in itself is sort of interesting to look at. It's, oh, well, are we seeing patterns there? And we get into that a little bit in some parts of the full analysis. So yeah, it kind of has to be treated differently in different networks depending on the type of relationship.
Great, thanks for that. And maybe while we're on Matt, one more methodological question for you. Someone noted it's not clear from looking at these network maps how those connections take place. So could connections be via telephone, email, personal communication, WhatsApp? Did you restrict anything there or take a look at how communication was happening?
We did not. That is something you certainly could do. In this case, because that would just be a whole other dimension to look at. We were looking at different types of relationships. Like that would be a different sort of analysis. We'd be looking at the means and the channels of the communication. So that's not something we looked at in this specific analysis, but certainly could be something if we wanted to do a deeper dive into, for example, information sharing specifically, to look at that at a deeper level in terms of the channels. And we're going to be considering different ways of looking at deeper dives into specifics for some of the future iterations.
Great, thank you. Moving on to a different presenter for Lucia. There's a couple questions about Ethiopia, in particular the coordination slide that you presented. A couple of people wanted to know what qualifies as coordination. How was that defined? And then as a second piece of that question, why was the Women's Association not in the coordination slide? Do we still have Lucia available?
Yes, I'm back on now. I was trying to unmute my mic. I'll start with the second part of the question and allow Matt to define coordination in this instance. It's not unexpected that the Women's Association were not part of the coordination group, because we're looking at coordination at town level, for example, specific activities like water safety plans that have been mandated by the national government. And what became clear was during the ONA is that the interaction between the women, if I go back and look at the diagram that depicts the coordination, a lot of those actors are really at that town level. The Women's Association's link tends to be with what's the neighborhood or Kabele level authorities. I'll now hand over to Matt to define coordination in this instance.
Yeah, in this case, right. So coordination can be defined depending on the nature of the network you're looking at. In this case, we defined it when we were doing the surveys as active joint planning or joint implementation of sanitation-related activities. So in this case, we were really looking at coordination as planning and carrying out activities together, rather than just sharing information or meeting about, not joint planning.
Great, thank you both. Another question here, which I'll initially point to Janita, since we haven't heard from her, but others can jump in after that as well. This is from Heather. Do we assume that more interaction is necessarily good? For instance, in the context of decentralization or in highly corrupt environments, are there maybe instances where we want to see the number of interactions decline?
Thank you for that question. That's actually an interesting question. It reflects a long discussion that we had in designing the ONA, and we ask ourselves, how much coordination and collaboration do we really want? And we didn't think as far as corruption. We only thought if everyone shares everything with all of their partners, and we have a total collaboration and a total coordination, that means we would all do the same. We would all agree on something, and we would all, there would be very little innovation, there would be very little discussion about what is the right approach. So the reason why we in Cambodia ask for information sharing is that this was sort of the level of coordination that we thought would be healthy for a network, and that we wanted to see more of. We couldn't necessarily say that we wanted to have 100% of collaboration between all organizations in the network, but we wanted to make sure that the information that exists within the network about what works and what doesn't work, and about experience and who does what where, and who could be my potential partners in my work, that is known and accessible to actors in the network. So yeah, I think that's a very valid point, and that needs to be discussed every time, again, you look at a network and you design it for your local context.
Thanks. Angela, did you have some thoughts on this from your experience in Uganda as well?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think
Sorry, we seem to have lost you just as you started to answer.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, now you're back.
Okay, great. So no, more connection is not necessarily better. So, I mean, one way to read that or understand that more connectivity could mean more access to resources, it could mean more access to information, but it could also mean a lot more administrative burden and a lot more responsibilities. And so I think it's about bringing this back to stakeholders also once we have it, to understand, what would be ideal, where would you like to see more connection, and where wouldn't you be? And I think it's can be easily misconstrued that working with the network and the analysis is about connecting everyone to everyone. But I think we know from experience that can really slow things down a lot, or burden stakeholders by forcing connections. Oh, come meet with us here, come meet with us there. And so that's where it's really about, once we know where the gaps exist, identifying, what would be ideal to bring into that communication pathway, or what wouldn't be, so that, it can be a little bit more strategic, because working with the whole system or a whole systems approach doesn't mean involving everyone, working with everyone all the time. It's really about identifying, strategic leverage points and whose priorities are what, so that those can be taken forward.
Great, thank you. Matt, Lucia, did either of you have any additional comments? Okay, we can move on to another question. We had a couple questions asking a bit about the difference between this ONA and stakeholder mapping or stakeholder analysis approaches. So I think the first question is, how is this different from a stakeholder analysis that we might traditionally do? And then a follow-up question about whether the country participants felt that this ONA analysis brought value, or did they see this as just a repackaging of the stakeholder mapping that we're used to seeing? So I think maybe I'll let Matt start with the how is this different question, and then turn it over to the country presenters about the participants' acknowledgement or non-acknowledgement of any additional value from this.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's one way to approach mapping stakeholders. There are many different approaches. One nice thing about network analysis compared to some of the other approaches that at least I'm familiar with is the quantitative nature of it. So having this really rich data and these different techniques that you can use to generate different metrics and different types of maps and detect different clusters in the data is something that isn't always doable from other ways of mapping stakeholders, which might be more kind of high-level conceptual mapping. But those have a lot of value in other ways. So I think it just depends on what you're trying to do. And this is one way to approach looking at stakeholder interactions. And other stakeholder mapping techniques don't necessarily look at interactions. They look at stakeholder dynamics from a different lens. So yeah, it's one tool in that toolbox overall.
Thanks. And any of our presenters want to speak to the question about whether the local stakeholders saw value in going through this process, whether this uncovered information they might not have seen from a more traditional stakeholder mapping, or what the general response was to this information?
I can speak for Cambodia.
Great. Yanita, can you get a little bit closer to your microphone?
Yeah, I'm trying.
Perfect.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
So our first reaction that we got in Cambodia was people looking at this map and saying, huh, I only know 1/3 of all these organizations. Now you can do that with a rigorously done stakeholder mapping exercise as well, but actually seeing these relationships, and I've not presented the data on confidence that you have in your partners, and seeing how you are evaluated by your partners. So we ask organizations to evaluate their partners and then self-evaluate. So lots of organizations evaluated themselves as their partners being more confident in them than their partners actually are. So this is the type of relationship data that actors in our network have never seen before, and part of the challenge that we encountered with this technique was that it was a new type of data, a new structure of data, and that needed some time for actors to wrap their mind around. And I think Angela put it really well when she said that actors don't act strategically within the network because they don't know their relative position in the network. So even if they're central actors that have a good overview of what happens in the sector, they have no means of knowing where they are positioned in the sector. So as a whole, as a network in total, that was a really useful exercise for our participants to see sort of the larger structure of that network.
Thanks, Yanita. Lucia or Angela, did either of you have anything you wanted to add, or should I go to another question?
I'll add something here. I think Juanita had made a comment earlier about the visual aspect of the diagrams that are coming out of the ONE, and it confirming some of the suspicions of some of what the actors knew. But we had a particularly interesting discussion during the presentations of these findings to our local stakeholders, where, if you recall, one of our diagrams is looking at the periphery organizations, and the Women's Associations was identified as a periphery organization, but so was the Finance and Economic Department. And there were questions that were being raised as to why finance did not play a greater role in sanitation, and perhaps it was confirming in some cases the prioritization of water over sanitation. But it actually led to a very interesting discussion where finance's role in the town, most of the links are through the municipal manager. It does not have direct links with any of the other entities, and its presence in the sector sort of ebbs and flows and increases during the planning phases. And that was used as a point of discussion, or learning rather, for the local stakeholders. Thanks, Liz.
Great, thank you, Lucia. I guess one more methodology question for Matt maybe to answer primarily. A couple of questions about what the lines represent in these network maps. So what actual type of relationship are you looking at? Are these just information exchange, or are they something else? And then there was a question from Kimmy about how did you decide what type of relationship was the most important to include in those network maps?
Sure. So I guess maybe I'm not sure I completely understand the first question about what the lines represent. So because it's different in the different maps and or diagrams that we showed. So each one represents whatever relationships or interactions or connections were being examined in that particular analysis. So in the case of information sharing, each line represented a reported information sharing relationship from one organization to another based on the survey. And I guess to help give some specificity, in that case, in the Ethiopia case, we asked specifically around any information sharing in the previous 6 months around sanitation issues. So we defined it for that specific context, but of course that could be asked differently in different contexts. So I guess from the diagram perspective, the lines represent the types of connections that were being analyzed for each context. So there's not kind of one overall answer there. But apologies if I didn't understand that question correctly. I'm happy to follow up more. In terms of Kimmy's question around deciding the relationships that we showed, so there's 2 parts to that. So first was deciding what relationships to ask about, to investigate to begin with. So in each of the contexts, there were different types of relationships that we asked about. And so that was decided based on scoping visits where we talked extensively and did stakeholder interviews with the organizations running these coalitions. So that's the SWS partners, because all of them had experience with running these sorts of coalitions in those contexts previously. So understanding what sorts of connections are really important in these coalitions. And then also talking to the individual facilitators who had been already done a lot of work assembling the coalition and getting people on board to understand, well, what do you think is important to look at? And then some cases we were able to actually talk to some of the anticipated or prospective members of the coalitions, or existing members, as the case might be, to understand from their perspective what sorts of relationships are important. So using that, we came up with the starting point of what we would ask about in the survey. Then, of course, there are many different ways to slice and dice the data. You can do all sorts of analyses. So what we try to do is create kind of a broad set of very high-level findings that looked at different types of ways of examining the data. So who's most influential in the network according to these different measures? Are there clusters? Is there a core? Are there different characteristics of the organizations that tend to interact together, as you saw in Cambodia, men-led versus women-led, et cetera? And try to present a broad set of those high-level findings to the organization, the people that are actually running these coalitions, to get their perspective on, well, which of these actually seems most meaningful? Because there might be something that, as the researchers, we thought was interesting, but that we could quickly ascribe as, oh, it's because of this, or maybe it's actually not that meaningful. There's another explanation. So just based on that feedback, kind of narrow down what are the categories of analyses that seem, and ways of examining the data that seem most useful, and then diving deeper into those. And so I can talk about Ethiopia. We asked about problem-solving relationships, reporting relationships, coordination, and information sharing up front. When we actually went back and shared the data back, it seemed like information sharing and coordination seemed to generate the most interest. So we did deeper dives on those, and in the future, we want to, in the future iterations, probably dive even more deeper into those and ask a little bit less about the other relationship types, which ended up generating less interest. So it was really just an iterative process of starting high and with high level results, and then based on feedback, trying to drill down more and more.
Thanks, Matt. And if Angela, or maybe with Duncan's support, can add to that, there was also a maybe somewhat related question about Uganda specifically, and whether in looking at those ties, did you consider any ways to collect the data other than self-reported about the connections?
Hi there, thanks, Liz. Yeah, so first of all, from Uganda, I can say the tie types that were included were information sharing, resources.
We don't seem to be able to hear you, Angela, if you are trying to speak.
Okay, my microphone says it's on. You're still not hearing me? I'm speaking. You hear me?
All right, doesn't seem like we have Angela at the moment, okay. But maybe she'll be able to chime in a bit. We're getting towards 10 o'clock here. Oh.
Hi there. Do you hear me? Would you?
Great. Yes.
Okay. Great. Yep. Sorry about that. So I guess on those different points, first I'll say, I mean, you can put anything on those lines, right? And they represent the lived experience of different stakeholders, which are complex and multidimensional. So it's really about how you define them and what you want to ask about. And so in the case of Uganda, we asked about information, resource exchange, and authority, which was derived from a definition of social power in terms of influence and authority. And then lastly, on skills exchange. And so, but you really could ask about anything. You could ask, you could build a network map around formal structures that exist, formal coordination structures, asking people who attends which meetings, and the network will look completely different in different circumstances. And so I've got Duncan on the line here, and I think he'll add on a little bit about different considerations in deciding what kind of tie types to include. Go ahead, Duncan.
All right. Thanks, Angela. Yes, a key consideration in the Cabarole context was that we were trying to see how the network extended from the district all the way down to the parish and the community level. And because of the lack of records for certain types of exchanges, such as skills or information, my experience has been that the reported data is the easiest to get. And so that allows us to see how these structures extend all the way down. But it's an entirely valid choice to say that at other levels of interaction or where data exists, we could say, for example, look at emails that are exchanged for some more formal record to construct these networks. And that would also be completely valid.
Great, thank you. So as we're wrapping up here, I wanted to give each of the presenters, Janita, Lucia, and Angela, about a minute to answer a question that's coming up in various different formats, which is, now what? So this was framed by some people as, is this an approach that can be expanded, that might be used across a whole country, such as Ethiopia or Uganda? But also sort of, now what do we do with this understanding? So what do we see as the next steps for changing the incentives and motivations of key actors within the network? And what approaches are you going to test? So I'll let you answer the now what with either of those, sort of how do we expand and scale this up, this type of work, or what do we do with the understanding now that we have it within the networks we're looking at? So maybe just go in the same presenter order. We can start with Janita.
Sure, thank you for the question. So there were a couple of how do I let me start the other way around. The first thing we did with this data was to bring it back to our stakeholders where the data came from, and present it to them and discuss the data with them, and see what sense they make out of it, and what surprises them, and what they saw in it, and harvest their ideas on how to use this data. So there were a couple of immediate things that came out of it. For example, given the stark differences in connectivities between Khmer and English-speaking organizations, there was a greater emphasis on providing simultaneous translations during key meetings to make these meetings accessible to all stakeholders, no matter their language, and to make them feel more welcome, and make them feel more welcome and make the meeting more accessible. Another thing is that came out of the immediate presentation discussion of the data was that an initiative on women in WASH in Cambodia has formed, and so they're at the initial assessment of what services they might provide. So we use this data in this fashion to start conversations with different subgroups, with different actors within the network, to see how we can address different aspects of the findings and of the analysis. So it's very much embedded in a process. It's not just here are the findings, this is what we need to do, but it's woven into the process of working with a network to identify where we need to head as a group together, as a network.
Thanks for that, Unita. Lucia, do you have anything to add briefly on that point?
Perhaps very briefly. So the immediate next step from this ONA in Waliso is that it has informed, or rather designed, the structure of the Learning Alliance, basically just to ensure that the needs and desires of organizations that have not been represented are now at the table and have a voice. For example, the Women's Association that represent the users, the direct beneficiaries of sanitation services in Waliso. And going forward, what this has helped shape is the key or the priority areas they would like to focus on. The first being the disposal side, and the second, an equally important issue of shared.
Sorry, did we lose Lucia there?
Liz?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
sorry. Where did I get cut off?
I'm not sure exactly where you were in it when I lost you.
Okay, well, I'll just repeat it then. Basically, what I was saying was that the immediate next step from this Learning Alliance is that it has designed or informed the structure of the Learning Alliance just to ensure that organizations that had not been previously represented have a voice at the table, and their needs and desires have been represented, and that's informing decision-making and planning. What this has now led to is the priority areas that the Learning Alliance has decided to focus on. The first being the issue of the disposal site in the town, but the second one being the issue of shared facilities, the conditions of public and communal toilets in Waliso.
Great, thank you. And so we're just at 10, but Angela, I want to give you a chance to give a similar brief now what for the Uganda work.
Sure. I mean, real quickly, I'll say we're still learning about this process. And so we're still reflecting on these results and these different maps that we have with stakeholders through that Learning Alliance process. And so, I mean, what we have is a great reflection point that can lead to stakeholders acting more strategically, but also ourselves recognizing that IRC is very much a part of the system in Gaborone and is also an actor, influencing through that hub Learning Alliance role. And so the next thing is, to also recognize that the highest level outcome we're looking for is not network strength, but we're really looking at improved service delivery. And so we're still learning about and going through these different data to understand, what are key leverage points we can identify in here, which will directly affect service delivery.
Great, thank you. So thank you everyone for attending. There's been great questions coming in, and unfortunately we don't have time to answer all of them, but I would direct you to the handouts tab again to look at those briefs. Also, information on SWS is available at globalwaters.org/SWS. And I should note the briefs have information to contact the authors. So for those of you who've been asking more questions about the methodology and what we learned, there is contact information there that you might be able to use to get some answers. So thanks to all of our presenters. Thanks to everyone for dealing with the connection issues and connecting from all around the world at all different times. So hope you all have a nice day or night wherever you are. Thank you.